One of the spookiest urban legends out there is the babysitter and the man upstairs. The scenario is quite frightening. A young girl is babysitting one night when she starts getting threatening phone calls from an anonymous figure. When she notifies the police, they inform her that the threatening calls are coming from inside the house. Even though the above situation is fictional, as there are many cases of teenager babysitters being stalked and murdered in movies, urban legends often do have some basis in fact. Babysitting can sometimes be a frightening experience in which it's easy to feel vulnerable, especially since plenty of real-life cases involving babysitters have ended in terrifying things happening. Number 10. The murder of Janet Christman. Many people believe that the urban legend, The Babysitter and the Man Upstairs, was inspired by a real-life murder case from Columbia, Missouri in the 1950s. On the evening of March 18th, 12-year-old Janet Christman was babysitting a 3-year-old boy named Gregory Romack. At 10:35 p.m., a police officer received a disturbing phone call from a hysterical female caller. He could hear the woman screaming and yelling the words, "Come quick," before the call was abruptly cut off. Unfortunately, during this time period, the police did not have the proper resources to do an immediate trace. 3 hours later, Greg Romack's parents returned home. The boy was sleeping in his bed, but Janet Christman's body was on the living room floor. Janet had been hit in the head with a blunt object and raped before she was strangled to death with an ironing cord. Even though the front window of the Romack home had been broken with a garden hose, nothing else in the house appeared to be disturbed. Since both doors were unlocked, police theorized that Janet willingly opened the door for her killer, who shattered the window to make her murder look like a break-in. The prime suspect in the crime was Robert Mueller, a friend of the Romacks who had reportedly made inappropriate lewd comments toward Janet in the past. Police believe Janet's head was punctured with a mechanical pencil, an item Mueller often carried. Mueller was questioned by the police, but since they detained him under questionable circumstances, a grand jury ultimately decided not. Mueller subsequently moved to California, and the murder of Janet Christman was never solved. Number 9. The disappearance of Lori Lloyd. On the evening of February 11, 1976, a 14-year-old Lori Lloyd was scheduled to spend the night babysitting at a residence in Kettering, Ohio, and was accompanied by one of her friends. At approximately midnight, Lori's mother went to the residence and saw that both Lori's friend and the child they were babysitting had fallen asleep, but Lori was not there. When Lori's friend woke up, she claimed that Lori had stepped out to walk to a nearby 7-Eleven, but she apparently never returned. No one from the 7-Eleven remembered seeing Lori that night, and she could not be found anywhere. According to another one of her friends, Lori had planned on meeting an unidentified boy that same night, and the couple were thinking of running away to California together. This story has never been verified, but it seemed unlikely that Lori ran away voluntarily since she left all of her personal possessions behind. The case took a bizarre turn in 1980 when Lori's family watched a produced documentary about drugs and thought they saw a girl resembling her in the background of a scene. Even though it is a standard practice for documentaries to get their subjects to sign release forms, the production company could not find paperwork for Lori or any other young woman who might have appeared in that particular scene. After nearly 40 years, Lori Lloyd remains a missing person. The murder of Jaden Lesky. In 1997, Australia experienced one of its most sensational and bizarre missing persons cases ever. On the evening of June 14th, Linda Lesky was invited to a party and had trusted her boyfriend Greg Demashowitz to babysit her 14-month-old Jaden. At 2:30 a.m., Greg left his home in Newborough to pick up Linda from a pub, but Jaden was not in the vehicle. Greg told Linda that Jaden was in the hospital following a minor incident, but since she was intoxicated, Greg convinced her it would not be a good idea to visit her son until the morning. However, when the couple returned home, they were surprised to discover that the windows had been smashed and a pig's head was now on the front lawn. When Linda woke up in the morning, Greg made a shocking confession. He had lied about taking Jaden to the hospital and actually left the child alone when he went to pick her up. Jaden was now missing, and Greg believed that the same people who had vandalized his home had abducted him. Tissues containing Jaden's blood were later found in an outside trash can. In January of 1998, Jaden's body was discovered inside a sleeping bag in a Blue Rock Dam. The child was believed to have died from head injuries, and his body was weighed down with a crowbar. Naturally, many people were suspicious of Greg's story. It turned out that the relatives of Greg's ex-girlfriend had smashed his windows and left the pig's head on his lawn as a prank, but they denied any involvement in Jaden's death. Greg Demotowicz was eventually charged with Jaden's murder, but was acquitted at trial due to lack of evidence. Officially, the murder of Jaden Lesky remains unsolved. Number 7. The suspicious babysitting activities of Suzanne Baker. In November of 2009, a bizarre babysitting story unfolded in Chipley, Florida, when 7-month-old Shannon Diedrich disappeared from her home. At the time, Shannon's babysitter was Suzanne Baker, the half-sister of Shannon's father. 5 days later, Shannon was found alive inside a wooden box inside Suzanne's home. Susan claimed that she'd kidnapped the child to protect her from drug user parents. Nevertheless, Susan was convicted on numerous felony charges and sentenced to 25 years in prison. This would not be the only suspicious disappearance to occur while Suzanne Baker was looking after a child. Over 20 years later, Susan was employed as a babysitter by James and Linda Baker, but the couple's marriage dissolved when James was discovered to be having an affair with Susan. James was subsequently awarded custody of his children, 6-year-old Nina and their 3-year-old Paul. By 1987, James was married to Susan, and they lived with the 2 children in Beaufort, South Carolina. On March 5th, Susan was babysitting Paul and claimed to have fallen asleep after putting Paul down for a nap. When she woke up, Paul was gone from the house. Around the same time, a family services office received a phone call from an unidentified woman who claimed to have taken Paul. However, suspicion turned towards Susan once it was discovered that both Baker children suffered constant abuse at her hands. Though there was never enough evidence to indict Susan for Paul's disappearance, she was sentenced to 10 years in prison for abusing Nina, but her sentence was suspended after only serving 80 days. Even though Susan Baker is now back in prison for another crime, she continues to remain silent about what happened to her former stepson. The murder of Pamela Mason. In 1964, 14-year-old Pamela Mason posted a flyer at a laundromat in Manchester, New Hampshire, advertising her services. It wasn't long until an unidentified man answered Pamela's ad and phoned her to say he needed a babysitter. On January 13th, Pamela left her home to go meet this man. 8 days later, she was found dead in a snowbank. She had been sexually assaulted, stabbed, and shot to death. Authorities noticed similarities between Pamela's death and the murder of an 18-year-old Manchester woman named Sandra Valade, which had occurred 4 years earlier. Weeks after Pamela's murder, a laundromat employee named Rena Paquette told authorities she had seen a man named Edward Coolidge taking an interest in Pamela's babysitting flyer and believed him to be their killer. The following morning, Paquette was found burned to death inside a barn on her property. After incriminating evidence was discovered in Coolidge's vehicle and his home, he was arrested and charged with Pamela Mason's murder. He was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. However, the conviction became the subject of controversy, as the searches to obtain evidence against Coolidge were believed to be unconstitutional. The case made it all the way to the United States Supreme Court in 1971. Since the Attorney General of New Hampshire had personally signed the warrants to search Coolidge's vehicle and property, the Supreme Court ruled that the warrants were invalid since they were not issued by a neutral and detached magistrate. As a result, Coolidge's first-degree murder conviction was overturned. He agreed to plead to the lesser charge of second-degree murder and was released from prison in 1991. While most people are convinced that Coolidge was Pamela Mason's killer, the deaths of Sandra Valade and Rena Paquette were never solved. Number 5. The disappearance of Heather Killorn. On the evening of July 14, 1999, 12-year-old Heather Killorn went to an apartment in Richmond Heights, Missouri to babysit the 2-month-old daughter of some family friends, Dana Madden and Christopher Herbert. At 4 a.m. the following morning, Herbert claimed he returned home to discover that Heather was gone and that his infant daughter was left unattended. 2 hours earlier, a neighbor had seen an unidentified man exit the apartment. This man was carrying what appeared to be a child wrapped in a blanket. A comforter blanket just happened to be missing from the apartment, and small traces of blood were found on the couch. DNA testing confirmed that the blood belonged to Heather. The case took a further disturbing turn once investigators found drug paraphernalia in the apartment and began to suspect that Dana Madden and Christopher Herbert had ties to a methamphetamine ring. Herbert allegedly stole some drug manufacturing equipment from a couple the day before Heather went missing, and it's been theorized that her disappearance is somehow connected to drug activity. 9 months later, Heather's mother showed up at the convenience store where Dana Madden worked and got into a violent altercation with her, accusing the couple of withholding information about what happened to her daughter. Even though Madden was at work and had an alibi on the night Heather disappeared, Herbert was frequently changed his story about his whereabouts. While authorities do have a person of interest, they lack the evidence to make an official arrest, so Heather Killorn remains a missing person to this day. Number 4. The murder of Kellyanne Tynes. On March 3, 1989, a 13-year-old Kellyanne Tynes was put in charge of babysitting her 8-year-old brother, Richie, at their home in Valley Stream, New York. When the phone rang that afternoon, Richie picked it up, and a man calling himself John asked to speak with his sister. After Kelly took the call, she told Richie that she needed to step out to go see someone. She did not return, so Richie went searching through the neighborhood for her and learned that Kelly was seen entering the home of a family named the Golubs. When Richie tried knocking on the Golubs' door, no one answered. The next day, police conducted a search of the Golub residence. They found Kelly's body wrapped in a sleeping bag inside of a closet. She had been raped and strangled to death before her body was mutilated. At the time Kelly was seen entering the Golub residence, there were 4 people in the house: 14-year-old John Golub Jr., 2 of John's friends, and John's 21-year-old bodybuilder brother, Robert. Even though Kelly received a call from someone named John, all the physical evidence at the murder scene pointed to Robert. While there was no suspicion that John Golub Jr. might have been involved in the crime, Robert was the only one officially charged. He was convicted of second-degree murder and received a sentence of 25 years to life in prison. Robert spent the next 2 decades maintaining that he was framed, but finally came clean during a parole hearing in 2013. He claimed that he accidentally knocked Kelly down some stairs before attacking her in a fit of rage brought on by anabolic steroids. In spite of this confession, Robert Golub's attempt at parole was rejected. One of the world's youngest known serial killers was Christine Falling, who earned the nickname the Babysitter Killer. Born in Perry, Florida, Falling experiencing a very abusive childhood, Her mental instability was apparent from an early age, when she started strangling cats and dropping them from high places to see if they actually had 9 lives. On February 25, 1980, 16-year-old Falling was babysitting a 2-year-old girl named Cassidy Johnson when the child was suddenly taken to the doctor's office with brain inflammation. 3 days later, Cassidy was dead. An autopsy determined that the child had suffered blunt trauma to the skull, and Falling claimed that she accidentally fell out of her crib while sleeping. There were suspicions about Falling's story, but unfortunately they were not properly investigated. Months later, 4-year-old Jeffrey Davis died while Falling was babysitting him, and the cause of death was believed to be heart inflammation. While Jeffrey's family attended his funeral, Falling babysat his 2-year-old cousin, Joseph Spring. Joseph wound up dying in his crib that day of an apparent viral infection. Falling soon got a job as a housekeeper for 77-year-old William Schindel. Incredibly, Schindel suffered a fatal heart attack during Falling's first day on the job. Shortly thereafter, Falling was watching over her 18-month-old niece, Jennifer Daniels, inside a car while her mother was shopping. The child suddenly stopped breathing and died. Falling's final victim was 10-week-old Travis Coleman, who also stopped breathing while she was babysitting him in July 1982. This time, an autopsy determined that Travis had died of suffocation. Falling was questioned and subsequently confessed to smothering Travis and all the other children who died in her care. She received a life sentence for the murders. I want you guys to let me know what you think of all of these heinous and unbelievable stories, crimes against children. If you want your true scary story featured on an upcoming video, email my email in the description box below to have your story featured. I need new stories, guys, because this channel is literally dying. I need a resurgence of support, new subscribers, new shares. Let's do this together. I want to do this differently because what I've been doing for the last 8 years clearly isn't working. So any ideas that you guys want to throw my way in the comment section or anywhere on my Instagram, wherever, I would love it greatly from me to you. Thank you.